Hollis Miller had lived his 36 years in the shadow of silence. He was a man built like a mountain, shoulders broad as a barn door, hands like hammers, but his strength wasn't what defined him. It was his loneliness. A widower with no children, his only companion was a cabin weathered by storms and seasons. The people in town called him Giant Miller, but behind the nickname was a man who avoided saloons, avoided gossip, avoided everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. His nights were spent staring at the fire, the chair across from him always empty, the bed beside him always cold. But that winter night his silence cracked. It began with a knock at the door, sharp and desperate, not the wind, not the creak of branches, but something human and trembling. Hollis opened it to find a child no more than 7, shivering in a torn dress, cheeks red from cold, eyes wide with fear. She whispered words that cut deeper than any storm. "They beaten my mama. She's in too much pain." The girl's name was Laura May, and her mother was Mary Ellen Carter, a woman Hollis remembered only from glimpses in town, a woman beaten down by the drunken fists of her husband, Elias Carter. In that moment, the silence that had kept Hollis apart from the world was shattered. He pulled the girl into warmth, then strode out into the snow with nothing but his coat, leaving footprints that marked the start of a reckoning he had never chosen but could no longer avoid. The shack by Miller's Creek was a ruin, its chimney dead, its air heavy with whiskey and damp straw. Inside, Hollis found Mary Ellen broken on a bed of rags, her face bruised, her wrists raw from rope, her spirit beaten but not destroyed. She warned him not to stay, her voice weak, warning that her husband would ruin him if he dared interfere. Hollis didn't argue. He simply lifted her in his arms, careful as if she were glass, and carried her into the storm. With her daughter waiting at the cabin, the three of them crossed the snow like shadows fleeing from a curse. When they reached his cabin, Hollis laid Mary Ellen on his bed and placed Laura at her side. He stoked the fire, fetched water, and tended her wounds with a quiet tenderness that seemed at odds with his sighs. His silence told her what words could not. "You are safe now." But peace was never safe in a town where gossip spread faster than wildfire. While Mary Ellen closed her eyes for the first real rest in years, Elias Carter was already in the saloon, spitting venom into his glass, telling anyone who'd listen that the Giant Miller had stolen his wife. The storm that night wasn't just snow, it was rumor, and it carried the weight of a coming fight. The days that followed shifted Hollis's life. He was no longer only tending cattle and fences. He was cooking simple meals for Mary Ellen, carving wooden toys for Laura, and waking each day to the sound of someone else breathing under his roof. The little girl began to look at him with trust, clutching the wooden horse he carved for her as if it were gold. Mary Ellen, however, carried the heavy shame of gossip. She knew the town would call her fallen, shameless, unfit. Hollis knew it too. Every trip into town, every glance that followed him told him as much. Yet inside the cabin, something warmer grew. Laura's laughter filled corners where silence once lived, and Mary Ellen's soft humming seemed to knit the broken man back together. Hollis took them to church one Sunday, and though Mary Ellen trembled under stares and whispers, he stood beside her, silent but unyielding. When a sharp-tongued woman tried to shame her at the church steps, Hollis's looming shadow and steady gaze silenced her faster than words ever could. That night by the fire, Mary Ellen whispered, "I've brought ruin upon you." Hollis simply replied, "It isn't forgiveness I'm after, it's peace." For the first time, Mary Ellen felt like she wasn't a burden but a woman worthy of protection. But gossip was only the beginning. Elias' fury was a storm brewing far darker than whispers. News of Elias' rage carried back to Mary Ellen in fragments from the store. threats of dragging her home by force, of burning Hollis's cabin to the ground. Fear returned to her like frost, but when she told Hollis, trembling, he simply said, "Let him come." His certainty shook her, both terrifying and comforting. Laura, sensing the tension, clung to Hollis like a father. One night she asked him quietly, "You won't let him hurt Mama again, will you?" Hollis pulled her into his arms and said, "Not while I draw breath." It was the kind of vow no law could write, the kind of promise only a man who had carried silence for years could give. That silence became a weapon, an armor stronger than words, but storms have a way of meeting storms. One evening, Hollis found a crude note nailed to his door. "She's mine, bring her out or I'll bring men to take her." Hollis crumpled it in his fist. By opening his door to Mary Ellen, Laura, he had declared his side, and there was no turning back. Outside, snow began to thicken, the land preparing for more than winter. It was preparing for war. The night the storm hit, the cabin shook under wind and snow. Mary Ellen worked quickly, shuttering windows, tucking food away, as though she knew this was not just weather but siege. Laura clung to her mother, clutching her wooden horse, eyes wide with the fear of a child who had already seen too much. Hollis moved through the cabin with calm precision, checking latches, securing doors, his silence steady as stone. Near midnight, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the storm. Hollis's jaw tightened. Through the shutters, he saw 4 men pushing through the snow, lanterns swaying. At their head was Elias Carter, his voice slurring with rage as he bellowed, "Miller, you think you can steal what's mine? Bring her out." Hollis told Mary Ellen and Laura to hide in the back room. He picked up his rifle, though he prayed he wouldn't need it, and stood in the main room as fists pounded on the door. The giant Miller didn't answer with threats. He answered with silence. Then he unbarred the door, lantern in hand, and faced the storm, and the men who thought fear would be enough to break him. The fight that followed wasn't chaos. It was resolve meeting rage. Elias' men came first, stumbling through snow and drink, but Hollis met them with fists honed by years of labor, each blow precise, each step unshaken. He was a wall of muscle and quiet fury, moving with the strength of a man who knew what he was protecting mattered more than his own life. The storm roared, fists cracked, snow scattered like sparks, but still Hollis stood. When Elias' men faltered, Elias himself dismounted, pride too heavy to let him retreat. He charged Hollis, fists wild, screaming, "She's mine, she always will be." Hollis caught his blows and answered with words heavier than fists. "She belongs to no man, she belongs to herself." Their fight became more than flesh. It was every bruise Mary Ellen had endured, every tear Laura had shed, crashing against the storm. Hollis slammed Elias against the porch post, fist raised to finish it, but then he heard Laura's small voice through the cabin walls. "Mama, is he gone?" That voice stilled his hand. Killing Elias would only haunt them with another ghost. Instead, Hollis flung him into the snow, pressed the rifle barrel to his chest, and growled, "You'll answer for what you've done, not here, by the law." The storm quieted as though the land itself had heard enough. Elias was dragged off by his men, battered and broken, his pride more damaged than his body. Hollis stood in the snow, breath heavy, his frame lit by the last flicker of lantern light, while inside the cabin Mary Ellen held Laura close, tears mixing with relief. When Hollis stepped back into the warmth, shutting the door on the storm, the cabin seemed to exhale with him. Mary Ellen's voice trembled. "You could have killed him." Hollis's reply was steady. "That's what he wanted, but he won't break me. And he won't break you again." Laura ran to him, hugging his leg, whispering, "You saved us." Hollis lifted her into his arms, her small body curling into his chest as if it were the safest place in the world. For Mary Ellen, it was the first time in years she felt something stronger than fear. hope. She saw in Hollis not just a savior, but a man who had chosen restraint over vengeance, protection over pride. And for the first time, she believed she was worthy of that choice. The storm outside finally passed, but the reckoning wasn't over. Gossip in town would grow sharper, justice would demand its price, and Elia's threats weren't gone, only delayed. But inside the cabin, a fragile peace had been born. Hollis, Mary Ellen, and Laura sat by the fire, the silence no longer empty but filled with something new, belonging. Hollis's once lonely cabin had become more than shelter, it had become a home. The giant who once lived in silence had found voices worth listening to, and the woman who thought herself broken had found safety not in pity but in dignity restored. As dawn brushed silver over the snow, Hollis's voice carried low across the cabin. "This is only the beginning." And in that moment, Mary Ellen knew he was right. Their battle wasn't finished, but together they no longer faced it alone. If you were moved by this story of strength, survival, and quiet defiance, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more stories that grip your heart and hold you until the very last word. Leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in Hollis's place? And share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even in the coldest storms, hope can still take root. Your support keeps these stories alive, and together we'll keep bringing them to light.